Okay, hello everyone and welcome. We'll give people just another minute to file in here, but as we're waiting, if you wanted to put your name in the chat and where you are listening from today, we'd like to know who is joining us. And also while we're waiting, we do have a couple quiz questions here to see how well you know what's going on in the world. So I'm going to go ahead and move to our first question here. So first question in the quiz here, how many of the world's one-year-old children received a vaccine against some disease in 2019? You have three choices: A, less than 20%, B, about 50%, or C, more than 80% of the world's one-year-old children received a vaccine in 2019. So if you want to, you can also go ahead and put your answer in the chat so we can see if any of you will get it right. All right, I can see we have a guess here for A, less than 20% of the world's children. Two more A's coming in, one B. So far, A is winning. Give you another couple minutes to answer this question here. How many of the world's one-year-old children received a vaccine against some disease in 2019? All right, so the most given response here is A, and the answer is C. More than 80% of the world's one-year-old children have received a vaccine against some disease in 2019. But if you got this question wrong, you are not alone. 70% of people get this question wrong. A lot of people don't realize that most of the world has modernized, and modern medicine in its basic form is reaching most babies. We'll do one more question before we get started here. So this question here, in 1980, roughly 40% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty with less than $2 per day. What is the share of the world's population living in extreme poverty today? A, 10%, B, 30%, or C, 50%? Again, you can go ahead and drop your answer in the chat. Oops.
It's there now.
Okay, great, there we go. My slides were a little bit behind. All right, I see one answer for C, a couple for B. One answer for A, another A. B, I'll give you another minute to answer this question here. All right, so the answer is A. 10% of the world's population lives in extreme poverty today. But again, a lot of people got this question wrong. 92% of people get this question wrong. That's a lot of people. It's difficult to accept that the extreme poverty rate declined faster than ever, while global inequalities at the same time became wider than ever. So we like to do these couple icebreaker questions at the beginning of this session, just to see how you see the world. And very often as journalists, we think the world is a little bit worse off than it actually is. And a big part of why that is because when we're reading the news every day, we often see things that are quite negative. We see a lot of negativity in the news. We see a lot of problem stories. We tend to see a lot less about what's going right in the world. And that's what we're going to talk about in this presentation today, how to talk about what's going right in the world, how to talk about all the people who are implementing solutions to these very big global problems. So today we will be learning about solutions journalism and human rights training. And my name is Kimberley. I work with Journalists for Human Rights. I am based out of Saskatchewan, Canada, and I will be one of the presenters today here. And Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. My name is Sarah. I also work for Journalists for Human Rights. I'm on Kwakwaka'wakw territory, so the northern tip of Vancouver Island in British Columbia.
And as we go through this presentation today, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A box that you can enter them into, and we will answer questions at the end of the presentation. We will also send out the slide deck to everyone who is here today, so don't feel the need to write anything down that is on the slides. And without any further ado, we can get going. So there are a couple things that we will hope you will take away from this session today. Those are what human rights journalism and solutions journalism are, how to identify the key elements of a solutions journalism story, how to strengthen audience growth and engagement with solutions journalism, and how to develop and report on stories using a solutions journalism approach. So the first thing we're going to do here is just watch a very quick video put together by the Solutions Journalism Network, speaking to journalists who use this framework and why they have chosen to do so.
Solutions journalism to me means taking a different approach to journalism.
Solutions journalism is actually completing the job of reporting.
Solutions journalism is about balance, not just looking at the problem, but also exploring ways to solve the problem.
And we're trying to help our town or our county or our city or our state progress to a better place. It's a critical part of how we resolve crisis.
Traditional media has been really great at reporting what the problems are. Solutions journalism is a way of looking at the other side of the story.
We need to deeply dig in, find out what's working, how it's working, and why. Solutions journalism is a way to take away the excuses of people who are doing a bad job. It's easy to forget that people are solving this problem.
Solutions journalism offers a lens into new possibilities.
It's very forward-looking. It's a new kind of product.
It's going out and reporting the story and then taking an additional step and looking at the bigger impact of that.
Society solving problems. That's useful for our audience. It's useful for other people in the field.
Just empowering them, just letting them know there is a solution. If no one is talking about the solutions, they won't bother to emulate them.
It's about going beyond demolition to construction.
Solutions journalism gives audiences a way to look into the future and imagine the possibilities.
Solutions journalism is what we should have been doing all along.
Okay, and now we'll talk briefly about what human rights journalism is. Sarah, if you wanted to take it away.
Sure thing. So some of you have probably or possibly already interacted with some JHR training before, but this is maybe a bit of a refresher for you and an intro to what Journalists for Human Rights does for those who don't know. So Journalists for Human Rights is an organization that supports the training of journalists in reporting on human rights. And the reason we do that is to empower journalists to cover human rights stories if objectively and effectively to affect change so that human rights are topics of discussion, are brought up in public discourse, and hopefully addressed. Hopefully people are empowered to make better choices and to advocate for their rights. So in JHR training, what we encourage people to do is identify whose rights are being affected. That's a pretty important part. Holding those responsible accountable is the other part of that. And being quite specific in describing what human rights issues are at play. It's not enough to just sort of say broadly that human rights are being impacted, like which ones? And also, and I think that this is sort of where human rights journalism and JHR's training has always lended itself towards solutions journalism, even if we weren't doing that specifically. We always encourage people to outline what realistically could be done about the issue, to give people sort of thoughts and ideas and plans for how they can affect change in their own communities and in their own lives. So this is sort of the theory that Journalists for Human Rights works under. So we call it the ripple effect, and it's that journalists get human rights reporting training, give them some tools, give them some skills. The media organizations that they work for publish the story, then people hear, read, or watch the story, they consume that news. People share that story with their friends and family, their networks, their communities, the community starts to talk about human rights issues, that becomes like a focus of the discourse in perhaps a more specific and pointed way, and that then community members push for change. So human rights story ingredients, we talk about panel, that's the acronym that we have for it. So this is sort of like guidelines and a bit of a framework for making sure that your human rights reporting is doing everything that it needs to do. So the first one is participation. So you have to get the people who are involved in the human rights issue or a solution, you have to have them participating in the story so that the rights of all are represented. Accountability, you have to go to the people whose job it is, who are empowered, and ask them for their responses, for what they're doing. You have to hold them accountable. Non-discrimination, this is also really important, that no human right is valued above another, that we're not, pitting any groups against each other, that we don't discriminate when producing a story. Empowerment, and this is also something that we're going to get into with the solutions journalism stuff, that the media can empower the public. That is what we all hope we're doing here. And then L is linked to human rights. So to make explicit the human right that you're talking about in that story, and link back to international regulations or other sort of documents and agreements that are in existence.
Okay, so now we will briefly talk about why the Solutions Journalism Network and Journalists for Human Rights have chosen to come together for this training. So Journalists for Human Rights, we began a partnership with Solutions Journalism Network to deliver this training because we believe that these two forms of journalism work very well together and that together they can expand human rights coverage. Economic development, community improvement, gender equality, and diversity are just some of the areas where solutions journalism can expand the quality of human rights reporting. So what exactly is solutions journalism? Solutions journalism is rigorous, evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. And for a story to be considered solutions journalism, there are a couple things that it has to do. There are a couple pillars that need to be present in these stories. So first, a solution story must feature not just a person, but a response to a problem and how it happened. We aren't just pointing out how great a person or a program is. We are looking at the steps, at the response they put into place and the steps it took to do so. Next, a solution story must provide available evidence of results. We're looking at effectiveness here, not just good intentions. And you don't need to have years of hard data to write a solution story. Sometimes evidence is simply someone from the community being served by the response, explaining how they were helped. These stories can happen at any point in a response. A solution story will also seek to provide insights that can help others respond to, not just inspiration. We want solutions to be replicable and for readers to understand how they could work in their own communities. And finally, a solution story must discuss limitations to avoid reading like a puff piece. The strongest solutions journalism stories use the rigor of investigative reporting to explore systemic underlying reasons for social ills and then critically examine efforts to address them. We're reporting on solutions as rigorously as we report on problems. Now, sometimes when you're just learning, it can be a little hard to remember all of these pillars. So there is an acronym that can help you out. You can remember that it's solutions journalism if it tells the whole story. So W here stands for what response does it address? H for how it works or the how done it aspect. O in that it offers insight, L for limitations, and E for evidence of the impact. And a very useful place that you can go to learn more about solutions journalism and see how those pillars act in a story, to see what they look like, is the Solutions Journalism Story Tracker. The Story Tracker currently has just under 13,000 solution stories, and all of them have been read and vetted by a real live person. So you know that if the story is in the tracker, it's going to hit all the pillars. And you can search lots of different issue areas. You can search by journalist, you can search by country of the response to find all these different types of solution stories.
So we're going to look at why human rights journalism and solutions journalism together. Like why bother doing this and why we see these as really natural allies. So when the media is weak, corruption, crime, and human rights abuses thrive. We've seen this again and again. When people aren't aware of the issues in the communities or their rights, or like they know about the issues, but they haven't had it framed for them, or they haven't been able to frame it in that human rights context. And also we see that abusers aren't worried about getting caught or being held to account or being held accountable. There's impunity going on when nobody is kind of calling out the bad behavior or the lack of response, the lack of support for human rights. So the solution, our solution, we believe that when media puts a spotlight on both the issues and the responses, which is what we're mostly going to talk about today, people learn about the issue, they can demand changes and accountability. And so the human rights reporting training that we do, it gives reporters the skills and the tools and the confidence also to report on these issues. So this example that we use, it's one of the solutions journalism networks, and they use it a lot. It's a really, really strong example of what solutions journalism can do, of the real world impacts that it can have. So the example is from Cleveland in the United States, from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And so there in that city, they had for years and years, they were reporting on the problem of lead paint and how it was poisoning children, lead paint in rental apartments, and how kids were at risk in these dangerous homes. And so they had reported on the problem, and they felt that nothing was getting done. Like there wasn't enough change happening in their city to address this problem. So what they did is they went to a different city, a comparable place that also had faced that issue. In this case, they chose Rochester, New York. I think it's New York. They chose Rochester. And they talked about, they did an investigation on how Rochester responded to the lead poisoning problem that they had in their city. And what they found was really drastic. It was really something. And their report really embarrassed the city of Cleveland, the administration there, because they found that reporters found far lower levels of lead poisoning in Rochester, and they found that common sense fixes that Cleveland had not implemented that readers could understand. So the inspection of homes was really one of the biggest ones. In successful cities like Rochester, homes were inspected before children were poisoned, whereas in Cleveland, it was after a potential issue had been reported. So, and they, as you can see in this table, they went through all of the different responses that Rochester was doing compared to Cleveland. So what happened? What happened was they took away the excuses that Cleveland had to say that this problem was intransigent, to say that this problem could never be fixed. So what happened was that Cleveland's health department director and 3 of the 4 deputy commissioners were either fired or resigned. The city lead inspection staff more than doubled, rose from 3 to 7. And this is probably the most important one. The city passed a plan that proactively inspects rental homes for the first time, modeled on a program highlighted in the series. So sometimes it's tricky to kind of see, we have a sense that our reporting is changing things in government or is changing the discourse. But for this, it was a really clear line between the reporting, what the reporters presented, and in terms of evidence from other places, and then what was eventually implemented in Cleveland. The state threatened the city unless it complied with the list of reforms. So it didn't just gain attention in Cleveland, it gained attention at the state level as well. And the state eventually published a list of banned homes. So Cleveland now posts warning signs on affected homes, which is empowering people to decide, there's a resource for them to be able to check and see if the rental place that they want to be living in is dangerous or not.
Okay, so now that you know what solutions journalism is, I'm going to talk briefly about why it's something that you should bring into your reporting. The first reason is that it can make your reporting more impactful. As journalists, we have a theory of change, where journalists act as whistleblowers and they expose wrongdoing. Pointing out social problems will spur reform. But are we all happy with how well that works? Does it actually work in the real world? Well, it turns out that more is often needed to create change. It is incredibly important that journalists expose wrongdoings, but it's also important that they take away excuses by showing that better is possible, like we saw when Cleveland highlighted programs in neighboring cities. Pointing out social problems and models for solving them will spur reform. The second reason you should use it is that it's just good journalism. You may remember the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2014 and a lot of the coverage that came out around this. Especially in North America, the coverage was very doom and gloom. It was very negative. It seemed like this was something that we were not going to be able to avoid and would be this horrible, calamitous event. But things turned out a little bit differently. You may be less familiar with the fact that some neighboring countries were able to keep their Ebola caseloads in the single or low double digits. Wouldn't it have been useful to know how they controlled the disease? That could have been very instructive for other countries. How many people here were aware that there was a vaccine for Ebola? I wasn't aware of that until I started doing this presentation, despite the fact that in 2014, I was reading this news regularly, but this incredibly important piece of information I hadn't seen. Or how many people here are aware of the fact that there was a highly effective cure for Ebola? Again, I didn't see this type of news. And why is that important? Well, when we cover the problem without addressing the associated responses, we omit critical information necessary for society to create change. And the third reason here that you should use solutions journalism is that it can increase audience engagement. What we've seen is that solutions journalism is something that audiences are very hungry for and they're very eager to read. And we do have a couple studies here that back those things up. So this survey here, it came from Reuters in 2017. And what we learned from this was that a lot of people are starting to turn away from the news. And one of the highest reported reasons that they are turning away from the news is because the people felt it could have a negative effect on their mood. In addition, 28% said that they don't feel that there's anything that they can do about it. So publics have started to become more news avoidant because of the negativity that they're seeing. And as journalists, that's bad for us. When we're doing this work, we want people to read it. We want people to engage with the stories that we're putting out. And so solutions journalism can help bring readers back into the fold. So this survey here we conducted at JHR with a Canadian institution called Leger, and we found that solutions is something that audiences are very interested in. We found basically the same thing as that Reuters report, that 6 in 10 Canadians are less likely to engage with negative media. But 7 in 10 Canadians are likely to engage with a news story that contains solutions to societal problems. And 81% of Canadians believe solutions journalism is important. And these findings have been echoed from other surveys as well. This one here comes from Smith-Geiger in the United States, where they showed people television news stories. They showed them both traditional stories and solution stories and interviewed them after to see which they preferred. And across the board, consumers preferred the solutions story. And having solutions in the news created a significant impact on the local news choice, and it also led to greater efficacy and personal action. People were willing to watch the newscasts that were further away from them over local stations because they contained solution stories. This is something that people were willing to seek out. And additionally, solutions journalism can have a positive impact on audience engagement. This data here, it comes from the Seattle Times, where they have a solutions-focused education lab. And they found a lot of really positive results from their solution stories. Plus 102% page views, plus 80% time on page, plus 230% social shares compared to their non-solutions coverage. And I think what these numbers show is that solution stories are something audiences want to spend time with, they want to engage with, and they want to share to their broader social circle.
So now you've learned why you want to do it, you might want to do it, you've learned kind of what it is. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the when and the how to get into doing solutions journalism stories. We're going to try to bridge that gap a little bit. For the when, we talk about, like, as journalists, you know, we're looking at this data about like audiences turning away from the news because it's negative and it's impacting their mood. That happens to us too. Like, that is a thing that is happening in newsrooms. People are tired, and it's really hard to carry those hard stories all of the time. So a good time to do solutions journalism is when you feel like you have sort of been banging your head against a wall, reporting on the same problem over and over and over. And there may be like new examples of how that problem is manifesting itself, but there's really nothing new. Like, there's no movement on it. Same thing for, you know, the flip side of it, when your readers are sick of reading that same story about the problem over and over and over again, when the problem is very widespread. So if we're looking at COVID-19, if we're looking at environment or, you know, climate change, these are problems, these are issues that are, you know, facing all of us in different ways for sure, but, you know, these are widespread issues. So under all of those circumstances, it would be time to look for a solutions journalism angle, and that can kind of change the perspective and change the course of the conversation around it. It's also really important to remember that it's not your job as a journalist to find the best solution. That's not your job. Your job as a journalist, like every other day you come to the office, is to report on what's there. And the reality is that what's there is sometimes people doing responses to these issues. So it's not your job, you know, part of writing or producing an article that is solutions journalism involves vetting it, involves finding the evidence, learning about the limitations, but it's not your job to present the absolute best solution. There is no absolute best solution. There's always somewhere or something that's doing something better. So if you want to take a look at how we find these stories, the first step is really to identify the issue or question of concern as precisely as possible. So I said COVID-19 and climate change. It would be really difficult to write a story about climate change. Like, that is a big, big, big topic. It has so many different ways that it's manifesting in so many different places. So you have to really identify what you want to write about. Like, what is the issue that is the most important to your audience, to your readership, and to your community, and then kind of work backwards from there. So what we talk about for solutions journalism is slices. So if the whole pie is climate change, then the slice is going to be pieces of that. So the big slice, what we want to ask ourselves is, who's doing well compared to others with similar resources? And also, who's made a newsworthy improvement? When we look at the small slice, what we're really asking, and what you should be asking yourselves throughout the process of doing solutions journalism, is who's doing it better. Now, it's important to think about what better means, because there's lots of different ways that can be interpreted depending on the situation, depending on the community. So you have to focus on what's the small piece of the big problem that's really important to your audience. And then think about who's doing a better job at that small slice. So better can be faster, it can be cheaper, it can be who's doing something more equitably, who's doing something that's more widely accessible or with better oversight, and who's doing stuff with better results for subgroups like youth, marginalized communities, and refugees. It's important to know that, like, faster and cheaper, those are two things that might be your definition of better for a story, for a community, for a particular issue, but they also might be in conflict, right? Like, building something faster isn't necessarily going to be the cheaper thing. So it's important to define what the thing, like what aspect is making the solution better. So here we've got a couple of examples of big issues and sort of smaller slices that you might pull out of them. And you can do this for any big topic, right? Like if you give it a little bit of thought, you will be able to find local impacts for anything. So here we've got childhood well-being. So that's kind of the big slice. And then the smaller slices might be low educational outcomes, churches, family systems, foster care, or youth in prison. And these are just a few examples. There will be loads more. And even these could be sliced finer, could be refined even more if you needed to. Similarly, for reproductive health, you could be looking at teen pregnancy, gestational diabetes, C-section rates, postpartum depression, and access to contraception. Again, there's loads more questions about reproductive health. There's loads more smaller slices about that. But it's a question of finding out what's going to be important to your audience, finding out like what the nugget of the story is going to be that you want to tackle. So one of the things that's really useful when thinking about approaching solutions journalism stories is starting with the evidence. That's often the piece that people sort of struggle the most with. What I've found in doing this training and in talking about solutions journalism, one of the big things that people sort of mistake for solutions journalism when it's not is reporting on really good ideas, reporting on it. And that's a totally valid thing to do. That is an important thing. It's important to get those ideas out into the world, but they're not going to be the foundations of solutions journalism stories, because solutions journalism needs evidence. They need some kind of proof of how effective this response is. So one of the ways that we do that, one of the ways that it can make it easier to find these stories is to work backward from outcomes. So we talk about the positive deviant. Normally, or maybe not normally, but I think that it's pretty common in newsrooms or in your journalistic practice to look at who's doing it the worst. If you're looking at sort of a, if you're thinking about when they do those global reports on stories about who's doing the worst academically, like which country's students are absolutely the worst at these standardized tests, that's the news that we get. And then sort of at the tag end, we might get an example of the country that's at the 3 top countries. But then solutions journalism pushes us to ask, why are those countries doing better? Like, what is it about those countries that are like pushing their grades up? So that would be finding the positive deviant and then digging deeper and finding out how did they achieve that success and what obstacles keep others from doing the same.
Sorry, there seems to be something the matter with my slides loading here.
Oh no, that's okay. We're going pretty quick
This
here.
is the next one I can get here.
That's all right. We'll just roll with it. It's good. So like I was saying before, recognize that there is no perfect solution. And if you are writing about something, or if you're producing a story on something and it feels like a perfect solution, you're probably doing PR, and that's not what we're doing here. So like I said before, it's not your job to find the best one. It is your job to report on what is actually happening in the world, as that was always your job. Solutions journalism is journalism. So someone is always doing it better, like we said before. And you can go, you can look at sort of equivalent jurisdictions that might be implementing something different, or even like in one community, but just report what's there. It's not your job to find the best solution that's going to solve the problems. That's not what you're there for. All right, so now we are looking at other key questions for solution stories. So these are sort of things that you need to be asking yourself, and to some extent asking your sources as well, to create these stories. So once you found something that you want to be working on, what should you be asking yourself? And these are questions that really address the 4 pillars. Nope, there we go. So how does the response work? It's not enough just to say, oh, a thing is happening. You have to say how the thing is happening. You have to describe what is going on and what like the context of the responses. You have to think about what metrics matter. This goes to the pillar about evidence. You know, you have to decide, like, it's always your job as a journalist to decide what counts as proof, what counts as evidence, what is convincing to both yourself and your audience. You have to, again, looking at limitations, who is this response not working for? Like, what is this response not addressing? And no single response can address everybody and everything. That's just not possible. You have to look at what the research says. In every community, for every response, there have been people who have been thinking about it and worrying about it and producing research about it for forever, right? Like, there is nothing is brand new. So there is going to be research, there are going to be experts. How you define expert is going to depend on the story, but there is a backlog of information that you should be tapping into and kind of checking in with. Listening to critics is super important. Again, you know, it's weighing evidence. It's deciding whether those criticisms are valid or relevant or coming from like a good and useful place or not. But listening to critics absolutely goes to limitations. And again, it goes to not producing puff pieces that are just PR for responses or proposed responses. Is it being replicated elsewhere can also be part of the evidence pillar. If it is working really, like if a particular response is working super well somewhere else, you can absolutely bring that evidence into your story. You don't have to, not every solution story necessarily has to have a comparison to a different jurisdiction element, but it can be really helpful. And also, again, speaking to limitations, what are the barriers to replication? What factors allowed a response to be successful to the extent that it is successful in one location or in one situation that aren't necessarily going to be replicable in other places? So ways to think about framing solutions journalism stories. So for, you know, we've got sort of 6 examples here. There's a little bit of overlap between them, and obviously there's other ways of doing it, but these are sort of the 6 that we think are kind of the most useful. So if you're looking at an everyday beat story, so if you're a cops and crimes reporter and all you're doing is reporting on cops and crimes, it might be really useful to look at somewhere that's doing things a bit differently in your beat. So this specific one is about a First Nations-led alternative to policing, and I believe it's in the Yukon. So instead of RCMP doing all of the call outs to this community, they have sort of community members who have been empowered to be there, and they're operating differently than the RCMP would and could. So that's an example of how to investigate a solutions journalism angle on a beat that you're very used to. The positive deviant, like we talked about, is, so this is a story from the Globe and Mail that looked at what hospital was doing the best in terms of organ transplant. We know that in Canada, there is a real, and in most places, there is a huge dearth of available organs for transplantation. The lists for people waiting them are very, very long. So the Globe and Mail reporters looked at who was doing the best and what allowed them to do the best, like what allowed them to achieve those numbers. Location transformation is another one. So this is a change over time. So if you have a city that has a really big problem with, say, houselessness, what can, and then implements a solution, you can go back and do a solutions journalism story on how that implementation worked in one place over a period of time. I think one of the things that we often encounter about solutions journalism is that people feel like it needs to be super in depth. People feel like it needs to be a magazine article or a whole documentary every single time. And that's just not the case. That's just not, like, you can absolutely do things quickly, go for a response that is small and local, and you can work backwards from a positive deviant there too, and write about a widely known problem. So the example here is a CBC story that was talking about research about a project that had just given money to houseless people, to people experiencing homelessness, and what the effects were and how that worked and what the limitations, and it is a quick one. There's also an example in the story tracker of a 75-second television piece that hits all 4 pillars. They don't get super in depth into any of them, but it's all there and it kind of tells you what you need to know, and it counts as a solutions journalism story. Apples to apples that's the big comparison one. That's sort of the approach that the Cleveland example showed with the lead. This particular one is a Canadian example, and so it's what Alberta could learn from Quebec when it comes to daycare, when it comes to the cost of childcare. So Alberta and Quebec are two Canadian provinces, and they are very different in some ways, but also very similar in other ways. So you can compare one jurisdiction to another. And then finally, the how done it, which is really like almost a chronological rundown of how a response played out. And this example is, how Quebec was able to implement paid paternity leave. So this is, when we talk about the who done it in terms of like a murder mystery, this is the how done it, and it's more of like a play-by-play how things played out for that response. So to sum up, solutions journalism happens when reporters regularly ask themselves and their sources, who is doing it better? And also regularly ask themselves, is there a possible solutions angle to this story? And sometimes there may not be. Like, it's not to say that every single story that you produce after this webinar has to be solutions journalism. Some publications might choose to do that, or they might choose to really focus on that. But it's another tool in your toolkit to do the news, and to do it in a way that people are ready to receive, and to do it in a way that sort of changes some of the perspectives and the conversation going around.
Okay, so this was a pretty quick introduction to solutions journalism, but there's still a lot to learn. So we do have some resources here available for people who would like to learn more about solutions journalism, for people who would like to go more in depth. So one great free resource is the Solutions Journalism Network Learning Lab. And what they have here is a whole bunch of toolkits on solutions journalism. So they have a toolkit on the basics of SOJO, and they have guides on reporting on certain beats. So if you're writing about education, health, violence, they have toolkits that really drill down into how to do solutions journalism on these beats. So I'm going to put the link for that there into the chat. Oh, we've got it twice. 2 links. Now you have no reason not to go. You can also—
We'll put it in the email as well that we're going to send out after.
We will send all of these out in a separate document as well. You can also go to the Solutions Journalism Network website. All the resources on there are free and they are excellent. I will also drop the link in here for JHR so that you can learn more about our programming and more about the solutions journalism that we do. Some other things for you here, and again, this will come out in the final resource documents. The Solutions Journalism Network, as I've already mentioned. There is a Facebook page where you can connect with other journalists who are interested in solutions journalism. We share educational opportunities, calls for pitches, stories, resources, all those types of things. And there are a number of newsletters you can sign up for, including our JHR Solutions Journalism newsletter. And I will put that in the chat there. I'm just going to type it, otherwise the URL will look weird. And you can always follow JHR on Facebook and Twitter. That's where we post a lot about upcoming training opportunities. These are our emails. In case you should have any questions, you can always reach out to us. We are here to answer those for you. And now I think we can open it up to questions in general. So if there are any questions from the audience, you can either put them into the chat or you can put them into the Q&A box and we can find them there. So we have about 15 minutes here for questions. So if anyone has any, you can feel free to drop them in the chat. Oh, we do have a comment here. I also find it effective to just create the platform for the audience to suggest local solutions. Sometimes a platform is all they need to take action. And what we have heard from a lot of outlets is that solutions journalism is a really great way to engage the community. If you're going out and asking your community, what are all the problems here? You know, they might not like you so much, they might not really want to talk to you, but instead if you go and ask them what's going right in your community, what are the solutions that you're seeing on a day-to-day basis, people can be very excited to talk to you about that, and they'll want to do that. And that's a wonderful idea to ask your audience what it is that they really care about. Sometimes as journalists, I think we assume that we know what our audiences want, but how can we really know if we're not asking them and we're not engaging with them? So that's a great idea. Thank you for suggesting that.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, just to make it really explicit, that's a great way to find ideas about, you know, often, you know, we talk about ways and like places to find or ways of approaching looking for storying ideas. And I think that one of the most important ones is really like going to the community that response or that solution is for, and finding out what they are doing for that issue.
And we have had a question come into the Q&A box here. How can I relate solutions journalism to create solutions for girls in terms of gender equality, capacity building, and emotional intelligence? Sarah, do you want to take a stab at this one first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's going and seeing who is doing work in those areas, who is responding to gender equality, capacity building, and emotional intelligence. You may have, you know, that may not be one single story. I would be surprised if it was. You may have to tackle it in sort of smaller bites, but I promise you people are doing work on that in your community and outside of your community in sort of equivalent jurisdictions. So going and seeing how they are working, what they're finding, and what's working in terms of responses for them.
And I would also say, yeah, I was going to go. That's exactly what Sarah said. And yet to just frame your reporting with that question of who's doing it better. So when you're speaking to people who are involved in these kinds of questions, I always think that's a good question that you should be adding into almost any type of interview. Even if you're going to be focusing this article on the problem, you can ask this question in an interview, and once you have written about the problem and people are aware of it, then you can go and you can take that issue from a solutions approach. And that's valuable for journalists to cover this story, but also for any civil actors who are trying to get change implemented in their region, in their country, in their state, wherever they might be. Like we saw in the Cleveland example, when you can take something and say, look, these people just down the road, they're doing it better. It becomes a lot harder for those duty bearers to just throw up their hands and say, oh, this is such a tough problem. No one can solve it. There's nothing we can do. If you can point out examples of people who are solving the problem, it makes it harder for people to be able to resist action. Thank you for the question.
Are there any others? It's great to see lots of people putting their hand up to collaborate and to work on this. That's good. We do encourage you to sign up for the newsletter. Yes,
the JHR and the SJN newsletters are some of the places where you can find the most opportunities, training opportunities, resources, all of those types of things. I do see, I believe it's a question here. You mentioned looking at data trends. Are there any publications that tend to publish papers that show these kinds of data trends, i.e. looking at solutions trends?
Not that I know of, but that doesn't mean they're out there. Or sorry, that doesn't mean they're not out there. And certainly I think that would be specific to where you're working on and what issue you're working. I don't, as far as I know, I don't think that there's a publication that looks at solutions writ large.
I would say though that anytime, you know, if you do have academics as some of your sources, to ask them the question, do you know anyone who's doing it better? Because same thing, when academics tend to get asked questions, it's who's doing the worst, who is performing most poorly. And so again, it's just another question you can build into your sources, who is doing it better. But I would also just suggest, you know, maybe following a couple of the academic journals for whatever beat you're working on or whatever type of issue it is that you're interested in. If you know there are lots of journals that deal with climate change, with the environment, with issues around women and girls as well. And so just getting those on your radar, and you can just flip through them and see, rather than looking at, you know, who's doing the worst in something, start to look at who's doing the best or who has made a really noteworthy improvement. Got a couple comments here.
Yeah. So we've got one that says, it's also important to note that in times of crisis, whether it's conflict or disease outbreak, people affected aren't just looking for a story. Many would look for life-saving information, absolutely, which solutions journalism offers, as in the case of reporting on Ebola. Yes, absolutely.
I would also say that when I was learning about, the negative coverage around Ebola, I compared that for myself to the negative coverage that was surrounding coronavirus right now. Reading all those doom and gloom stories when I was quarantined in my basement was absolutely no help for me, and it was rather negative for my mental health. So when I read stories, even now about COVID-19, I like to look for stories that offer solutions. There's one that I often think about that came out of a very small Alberta newspaper that was about a COVID-19 text messaging program that was offering mental health services to people during the pandemic and during the lockdown. Those types of stories, they can really offer something to the reader. Maybe after reading that story, someone went and signed up and they were able to find a bit of reprieve from whatever, mental anguish or issues they were going through. So exactly, really can offer something to your readers. We have a comment here. I'm a student journalist from Nigeria. I would like to connect with people here to work on some programs or to serve as a volunteer. I'm still new to solutions journalism and I would like to know more about it. If you are interested in those types of things like networking or learning more about solutions journalism, really suggest that you take advantage of that list of resources that we're going to send out. The Facebook page, for example, can be a great way to connect with other journalists. So lots of opportunities for collaboration and to see who else is doing this type of work in your region.
Absolutely, and this, particularly the solution story tracker for that as well. You can search by region, you can search by topic, you can be inspired by what the stories that are produced there, and you can also look at the publications in your region that are doing this work. You can find the journalists in this region that are in your region that are doing this work, and maybe reach out to them and see if you can get involved that way.
Yes, because we actually just had a question along that line. Is there a way to get a mentor in solutions journalism? That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, you have Kim and I. We are available for your questions. Yeah.
And like Sarah said, I would suggest, looking at your country, look at the outlets as well who are doing the solutions journalism. Are those outlets open to pitches? Because that could be a good place to start as well, trying to get your solutions work out there and working with an editor who might know more about it. I would again mention signing up for the Solutions Journalism Network, just to keep an eye on any, and Journalists for Human Rights as well, just to keep a lookout for any initiatives that might be coming up in your region. So those newsletters can be very good for finding those types of things as well.
Okay, we have a comment here saying that I reported on the Ebola outbreak and solutions journalism was my way in and out of every story. That makes a lot of sense. And, as we saw, there was coverage at the time about solutions and responses to Ebola. It just wasn't necessarily sort of penetrating into the North American market, which is often, I think, the case. But the appetite for it is growing. Solutions Journalism Network has been doing a huge amount of work since it started in not only teaching journalists, I think, about solutions journalism, but also in turn audiences. And audiences are demanding it and are wanting more of that, like we were showing you in the presentation. Change begets change.
We do have just a couple minutes left here if anyone has any lingering questions. Well, if we wait for, a final question to come in, maybe I can ask one then. And that's, how can you do your best to ensure that solutions journalism is distinct and different from PR or advocacy? Because this is a question that we get a lot in trainings. Sarah, would you like to answer it first? Since I asked?
Sure. Yeah, no, I was sorry, I was looking at the chat being like, so it is being a journalist, it is rigorous reporting. So it's not enough that the proponent of a response or the proponent of a solution, the people who have thought about it and decided to implement it, it's not enough that they say that it's good. You have to find evidence for it, how it is working, and however it is working. You can write a solution story about a response that has absolutely flopped. That is still solutions. It doesn't have to be something that has been a success. I think those stories are a little bit more rare because it's difficult to get people to talk to you about their absolute flops. But if you can do them, those are really valuable. So it's looking for evidence. And again, as Kim said up top, I encourage you to sort of broaden your idea of what evidence looks like. Yes, numbers are very helpful and convincing. If you can get good data, that is a super powerful tool. But also, if you can get the people whose lives are being impacted by both the issue and the response to talk about their experience of it, that is also evidence. That is also data. So one big piece is that evidence. The other big piece is the limitations. PR doesn't talk about limitations, really. It doesn't put an emphasis on sort of the boundaries of how a response is working. So if you're discussing limitations in a meaningful and rigorous way, and not just as a, sort of tossed off at the very end, you're not going to be doing PR. Those are sort of the two big pillars. The other thing that I think is useful to think about is to not overstate the solution, is to not overstate, like, you don't look into the future necessarily. Report on what's there, report on what has evidence, and you can be transparent about what people don't know. I know in Canada, there's a real data gap, like there's a real lack of data and information and numbers on a lot of things, and we can outline sort of the boundaries of what we don't know as well. And being transparent with your audience is a really important way, to just do journalism, and also to gain credibility for both yourself as a journalist, your publication, and also the solution that you're reporting on.
And I would just add a tip, that's something you can do, is just start with the evidence pillar. Start with the evidence and then work from there. I think the strongest solution stories combine both qualitative, so that's hearing from the people who are involved in the problem, and the quantitative, so the data or the hard numbers as evidence. And it's best if those two back each other up, so you really have more support for the fact that this solution is working, or maybe support that it isn't really working. And so starting from the evidence can be a good way to frame your reporting. Oh, someone just echoed exactly what I said.
Yep.
The evidence can be in two forms: quantitative, which is more on numbers, while the other is qualitative, which is in the form of interviews. And both are very important for your reporting, because maybe the numbers that are coming out are saying that this program is great. But when you speak to the people who are actually meant to be helped by this response, they're giving you a different answer. They're saying, well, actually, it's not really addressing what we would like to see happen. That's incredibly important and should be included in your reporting as a pretty big limitation of this program. We also had people from the audience giving the exact right answer. What differentiates SOJO from PR is 1, evidence of impacts, and 2, limitations.
Absolutely. And that sort of also gets back to that question about different kinds of evidence and what counts as good evidence. That gets back in some ways to that question that we were talking about in terms of what metrics are important. Some programs, governments, whatever, will measure things that on the other end are less important to the communities being impacted. So it's always important to sort of interrogate the evidence, and make sure it's saying what you need it to, or what it says it is.
Vet your data. Very important.
Vet your data. That's it.
I don't see any other questions in the chat, and we are right at time, ending perfectly for once. So again, I'll just reiterate, we will send out the slides, a copy of the recording, and a list of resources for you to continue on in your solutions journey. But other than that, I think we are very happy to have had you all join us today, and we hope that you were able to take something useful away from this session.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and we hope to see your solutions journalism work in the world.
And if you ever do write a solution story, please send it to us.
Yeah, let us know.
Read it. We love to read all of these stories that you wonderful journalists are producing. And just a reminder, our emails are there as well if you have any additional questions or if you would like to follow up with anything in the future. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much, everybody.